Chloe stood at the kitchen window, her fingers tracing the condensation on her coffee mug as she gazed out at the rain-soaked garden. The dreary weather mirrored her mood, a stark contrast to the vibrant flowers that struggled to maintain their bloom in the downpour. She sighed, her breath fogging the glass, momentarily obscuring her view of the world outside. At 42, Chloe had thought she had life figured out. A successful career as a high school principal, a stable marriage of 15 years to Mark, and a beautiful home in the suburbs. She had achieved everything society deemed worthy of pursuit. Yet, as she stood there in her immaculate kitchen, surrounded by gleaming appliances and marble countertops, she felt an inexplicable emptiness gnawing at her core. The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke her reverie. Jayden, her 24-year-old stepson, appeared in the doorway, his dark hair tousled from sleep, his lean frame still carrying the languor of a late morning. Chloe's heart skipped a beat, a reaction she had been struggling to suppress for months. "Morning, Chloe," Jayden mumbled, making his way to the coffee maker. "Dad already left?" Chloe nodded, forcing a smile. "Early meeting. He'll be gone all weekend for that conference in Chicago." Jayden grunted in acknowledgement, his back to her as he poured his coffee. Chloe found her eyes tracing the lines of his shoulders, the way his t-shirt clung to his back. She quickly averted her gaze when he turned around, feeling a flush of shame creep up her neck. "Any plans for the weekend?" she asked, desperate to fill the silence with something, anything, to distract from the tension she felt building between them. Jayden shrugged, leaning against the counter. "Might go out with some friends tonight. You?" "Just some work to catch up on," Chloe replied, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. "You know, end of the semester stuff." Jayden nodded, his eyes meeting hers for a moment too long. Chloe felt her breath catch in her throat, the intensity of his gaze stirring something deep within her. She broke eye contact first, busying herself with rinsing out her mug in the sink. "Well, I should get going," Jayden said, placing his empty cup in the dishwasher. "See you later, Chloe." As he left the kitchen, Chloe gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles turning white. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing heart. This attraction, this forbidden desire, had been building for months, ever since Jayden had moved back home after graduating college. At first, she had dismissed it as a fleeting fancy, a midlife crisis manifesting itself in the worst possible way. But as the weeks turned into months, the feelings only intensified. Chloe spent the day immersed in paperwork, grateful for the distraction. As evening approached, she found herself restless, pacing the empty house. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder as the storm outside intensified. She was in the living room, a glass of wine in hand, when she heard the front door open. Jayden stumbled in, soaked to the bone, his plans for the night clearly derailed by the weather. "Jesus, it's coming down out there," he muttered, shaking water from his hair. Chloe rose, concern overriding her earlier discomfort. "You're drenched. Let me get you a towel." She hurried to the linen closet, returning with a large, fluffy towel. As she handed it to Jayden, their fingers brushed, sending a jolt of electricity through her body. Jayden's eyes met hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. "Thanks," he said softly, his voice husky. Chloe swallowed hard, taking a step back. "You should change into some dry clothes. I'll make some hot tea." In the kitchen, Chloe's hands shook as she filled the kettle. She could hear Jayden moving around upstairs, the sound of drawers opening and closing. She closed her eyes, trying to banish the image of him changing that had unbidden entered her mind. When Jayden came back downstairs, he was wearing sweatpants and a faded t-shirt. His hair was still damp, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. Chloe handed him a steaming mug of tea, careful not to let their hands touch again. "Thanks," Jayden said, settling onto the couch. "Guess my night out was a bust." Chloe sat in the armchair across from him, cradling her own mug. "The storm's supposed to last all night. Probably for the best you came home early." They sat in silence for a while, the rain pattering against the windows, providing a soothing backdrop. Chloe found herself stealing glances at Jayden, admiring the way the soft lamplight played across his features. She felt a pang of guilt, knowing she shouldn't be looking at her stepson this way, but unable to stop herself. "Can I ask you something, Chloe?" Jayden's voice broke the silence, startling her. "Of course," she replied, her heart rate quickening. Jayden hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "Are you happy? With Dad, I mean." The question caught Chloe off guard. She opened her mouth to give the automatic response, the one she had been giving for years. Of course, she was happy, but something in Jayden's gaze, something vulnerable and searching, made her pause. I don't know," she admitted, the words feeling like a betrayal even as they left her lips. "Your father is a good man. He's kind, he's successful, he provides for us. But sometimes, I wonder if there's something missing." Jayden nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've noticed. The way you look sometimes, when you think no one's watching, like you're searching for something." Chloe felt exposed, as if Jayden had peered into her soul and laid bare all her secret longings. "It's complicated," she whispered. "Life usually is," Jayden replied, setting down his mug and leaning forward. "But Chloe, you deserve to be happy. Really happy, not just content." His words hung in the air between them, charged with unspoken meaning. Chloe felt her resolve crumbling, the walls she had carefully constructed around her heart beginning to crack. "Jayden," she began, her voice trembling. "We can't." But before she could finish, a loud crack of thunder shook the house, followed immediately by darkness as the power went out. Chloe gasped, momentarily disoriented by the sudden blackness. "Stay there!" Jayden's voice came from somewhere in front of her. "I'll find some candles." Chloe heard him moving around, the sound of drawers opening and closing. A moment later, a warm glow filled the room as Jayden lit several candles, placing them on the coffee table. In the flickering candlelight, Jayden's face looked different, older somehow, more intense. He sat down next to Chloe on the couch, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Are you cold?" he asked, noticing her slight shiver. Before she could respond, Jayden had draped a throw blanket over her shoulders, his hands lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Chloe's breath caught in her throat at the contact. "Jayden," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "We shouldn't." "Shouldn't what?" he asked, his face inches from hers. "Talk honestly? Feel something real?" Chloe closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. "You're my stepson. It's wrong." "Is it?" Jayden's voice was low, husky. "Or is it wrong to deny what we both feel?" When Chloe opened her eyes, Jayden was even closer, his gaze flickering between her eyes and her lips. The air between them crackled with tension, years of unspoken desire threatening to explode. "I've seen the way you look at me," Jayden continued, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "It's the same way I look at you when you're not watching." Chloe knew she should pull away, should put a stop to this before it went too far. But the feeling of Jayden's hand on her skin, the warmth of his body so close to hers, was intoxicating. She found herself leaning into his touch, her body betraying her mind's feeble protests. "We can't do this," she murmured, even as she tilted her face towards his. "We already are," Jayden replied, and then his lips were on hers. The kiss was electric, igniting every nerve ending in Chloe's body. She gasped against Jayden's mouth, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair. All thoughts of propriety, of right and wrong, vanished in the face of this overwhelming passion. Jayden deepened the kiss, his tongue seeking entrance, which Chloe granted without hesitation. She moaned softly, lost in the sensation of his lips, his hands now roaming her body with an urgency that matched her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Chloe felt dizzy with desire. She looked at Jayden, his lips swollen from their kiss, his eyes dark with want, and knew there was no going back. "We shouldn't," she said again, but there was no conviction in her words. Jayden smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. "But we will." What followed was a night of passion unlike anything Chloe had ever experienced. In the candlelit darkness of the living room, they explored each other's bodies with a fervor that bordered on desperation. Clothes were shed, inhibitions abandoned, as they gave in to the desire that had been building for months. Chloe marveled at the feel of Jayden's young, toned body beneath her hands. She traced the lines of his muscles, reveling in the way he shuddered at her touch. Jayden, in turn, worshipped her body with a reverence that made her feel more alive than she had in years. Their lovemaking was intense, almost frantic at times, as if they were both afraid this moment might slip away. Chloe lost herself in the sensations, the feel of Jayden inside her, the sound of his breath in her ear, the taste of his skin on her lips. As they lay tangled together afterward, sweat cooling on their skin, reality began to creep back in. Chloe felt a wave of guilt wash over her, threatening to drown the afterglow of their passion. "Oh God," she whispered, burying her face in her hands. "What have we done?" Jayden pulled her close, his arms encircling her protectively. "We didn't do anything wrong, Chloe. This is real, what we feel for each other." Chloe wanted to believe him, wanted to lose herself in the comfort of his embrace. But the weight of their actions pressed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. "Your father," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "How can I face him after this?" Jayden was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, "together." But as the night wore on and the candles burned low, Chloe's anxiety grew. By the time dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, she had made a decision. "This can't happen again," she told Jayden, her voice firm despite the pain in her heart. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. We need to forget it ever happened." Jayden's face fell, hurt and confusion warring in his eyes. "Chloe, please, don't do this. What we have is special, you can't deny that." "I'm married to your father," Chloe replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This, whatever this is, it ends now." She gathered her clothes and fled to the safety of her bedroom, leaving Jayden alone in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of their passionate night. The days that followed were a torture of awkward silences and furtive glances. Chloe threw herself into her work, staying late at the school to avoid being home. Jayden, for his part, seemed to be honoring her wishes, keeping his distance even when they were in the same room. Mark returned from his conference, oblivious to the tension that hung in the air like a heavy fog. Chloe plastered on a smile, playing the role of the dutiful wife while her heart ached for what she had tasted and lost. Weeks passed, and Chloe thought perhaps they had weathered the storm. The intensity of her feelings for Jayden began to dull, replaced by a constant, low-grade ache that she learned to live with. She convinced herself that what had happened was a one-time lapse in judgment, a mistake that would never be repeated. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It was a warm evening in late spring when everything changed again. Chloe was in the backyard, tending to her flower beds, when she heard the gate open. She looked up to see Jayden entering, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "What's going on?" she asked, rising to her feet and brushing dirt from her hands. Jayden's face was set in determined lines. "I'm leaving," he said. "I can't stay here anymore, pretending everything's normal when it's not." Chloe felt her heart constrict. "Jayden, we talked about this. What happened? It can't happen again." "I know," he replied, his voice tight with emotion. "That's why I have to go. I can't be around you every day, loving you, knowing you feel the same way, and not be able to do anything about it." Chloe wanted to protest, to tell him he was wrong, that she didn't love him. But the words stuck in her throat because she knew they would be a lie. "Where will you go?" she asked instead, hating how small her voice sounded. "I got a job offer in Seattle," Jayden said. "I'm going to take it, make a fresh start." Chloe nodded, fighting back tears. "Does your father know?" "I left him a note," Jayden replied. "I couldn't face him, not after everything." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Jayden took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "I love you, Chloe," he said softly. "I think I always have in some way. And I know you love me too, even if you can't admit it." Chloe felt her resolve crumbling. "Jayden, please." But before she could finish, He had pulled her into his arms, his lips crashing down on hers in a kiss that was equal parts passion and desperation. Chloe melted into him, all thoughts of resistance fleeing in the face of the overwhelming emotions coursing through her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Jayden rested his forehead against hers. "Come with me," he whispered. "We can start over, be together without all this guilt and secrecy." For a moment, Chloe was tempted. The thought of leaving everything behind, of building a new life with Jayden, was intoxicating. But reality intruded, harsh and unforgiving. "I can't," she said, her voice breaking. "My life is here, my career, my friends. I can't just walk away from everything." Jayden stepped back, pain etched across his features. "I understand," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I guess this is goodbye then." Chloe watched, tears streaming down her face, as Jayden walked away. She wanted to call out to him, to beg him to stay, but she remained silent. The gate closed behind him with a finality that felt like a physical blow. In the days and weeks that followed, Chloe moved through life in a daze. She went through the motions at work, smiled and nodded at the right times when Mark spoke, but inside she felt hollow. The vibrant woman she had been during those stolen moments with Jayden seemed to have disappeared, leaving behind a shell of her former self. Mark, to his credit, sensed that something was wrong. He tried to draw her out, suggesting vacations and date nights, but Chloe remained distant, unable to bridge the emotional chasm that had opened between them. She felt guilty for her inability to reciprocate his efforts, which only added to the weight of her secret. As summer faded into autumn, Chloe found herself standing at the kitchen window once again, watching the leaves change color and fall from the trees. The garden she had so lovingly tended now lay dormant, mirroring the state of her heart. She thought of Jayden often, wondering where he was, if he was happy, if he ever thought of her. It was on a crisp October morning that everything changed again. Chloe was at her desk at school, reviewing student files, when her secretary knocked on the door. "Mrs. Henderson, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." Chloe looked up, her brow furrowed. "I don't have any appointments scheduled. Who is it?" The secretary hesitated. "He says his name is Jayden. Should I send him in?" Chloe felt her heart stop for a moment, then start again at double speed. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. When Jayden walked through the door, Chloe's breath caught in her throat. He looked different, older somehow, more mature. His hair was longer, and he sported a neatly trimmed beard. But his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had haunted her dreams for months, were the same. "Chloe," he said softly, closing the door behind him. "Jayden," she replied, rising from her chair. "What are you doing here?" He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I couldn't stay away. I tried, God knows I tried, but I couldn't stop thinking about you." Chloe felt her resolve weakening. "Jayden, we can't do this. Nothing has changed." "Everything has changed," he countered. "I'm not your stepson anymore. Dad filed for divorce last week." The news hit Chloe like a physical blow. "What? Mark never said anything." Jayden's expression softened. "He wanted to tell you in person. He's flying back from a business trip tonight." Chloe sank back into her chair, her mind reeling. "I don't understand. Why would he?" "He knows, Chloe," Jayden said gently. "About us. He's known for a while." The blood drained from Chloe's face. "How?" Jayden ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made Chloe's heart ache. "He found my journal. I'd written about my feelings for you, about that night during the storm. He confronted me about it when I visited him in Chicago last month." Chloe felt sick. The idea that Mark had known all this time, had been carrying this knowledge while still trying to save their marriage, was almost too much to bear. "Why didn't he say anything?" she whispered. "He wanted to give you a chance to come clean," Jayden replied. "But when you didn't, he realized it was over. He told me he'd rather set you free than live with the knowledge that you were in love with someone else." Chloe buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by guilt and shame. "Oh God, what have I done?" Jayden knelt beside her chair, gently pulling her hands away from her face. "You haven't done anything wrong, Chloe. We can't help who we fall in love with. She looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "But I hurt him. I betrayed him." "And you've been punishing yourself for it ever since," Jayden said softly. "Don't you think it's time to forgive yourself?" Chloe stared at him, seeing the love and understanding in his eyes. Despite everything, despite the guilt and the pain and the complications, she felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jayden took her hands in his touch sending shivers up her arms. "That's up to you. I love you, Chloe. I want to be with you, to build a life together, but I understand if you need time." Chloe closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in months. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "But we can't just pick up where we left off. There's too much history, too much pain." Jayden nodded, a mix of hope and apprehension in his eyes. "So what do we do?" Chloe squeezed his hands. "We start over, slowly. We get to know each other as adults, outside of the context of our family. And we deal with the fallout from our choices." "Together?" Jayden asked, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Together," Chloe confirmed. As they left her office hand in hand, Chloe felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be difficult conversations with Mark, judgmental whispers from colleagues and friends, and the challenge of building a relationship on such complicated foundations. But for the first time in months, Chloe felt truly alive. She knew that love, in all its messy, complicated glory, was worth fighting for. And as she looked at Jayden, seeing her future reflected in his eyes, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The autumn sun was setting as they walked to their cars, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Chloe paused for a moment, taking in the beauty of the scene. "It's a new beginning," she murmured. Jayden squeezed her hand. "For both of us." As they drove away from the school, heading towards an uncertain but hopeful future, Chloe felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer running from her feelings or hiding behind a facade of contentment. She was embracing the complexity of love, with all its joy and pain, and she was doing it with the man who had awakened her heart. The road stretched out before them, full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, Chloe was excited to see where it would lead.